Looking for no bullshit conversation about mental health? Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
I start reading something and then I'm thinking about, something triggers a sort of tangential thought based on what I just read. And now that thought is triggering multiple other tangential thoughts. And I'm reading all the words on the page, but I'm not thinking about what I'm reading. I'm thinking about 10 other things.
Well, hi there. It's Matthew Blayton. Welcome to the ADHD episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. I'm convinced that the more I read about adult ADHD, the more I sort of resonate with what I'm reading. And that's why I reached out to Eric Tivers. He runs a website called ADHDrewired.com. I stumbled on it one night, reached out to him. I said, based on what I'm reading, I've got to get you on the podcast to describe your story, to describe what you know about people who have ADHD, specifically adults that have ADHD. Now, he didn't learn till later in life, and we're going to jump into that discussion today with him. But first, let's open up with a story about his childhood.
There's a story that I tell sometimes when I'm presenting about when I was in preschool, where my mom picks me up and I tell my mom, I don't think my teacher knows my name. And she says, well, why would you say that? Of course she knows your name. Well, she keeps calling me Don't Eric.
Wow.
Yeah.
Don't Eric.
Yeah. So, I was not in a sense, the stereotypical presentation of ADHD because I wasn't really hyperactive. Because you can have ADHD without the H, but they still call it ADHD. So, I struggled in school. I would be doing all right. Then I would get the, maybe the parent teacher conferences or the call or email home, and say, well, you're failing this class. So then I would just focus really intently, got the grade up, so it's good enough, and kind of just barely skate by. Right. Mm-hmm. And I always sort of knew that I was smart, but like school was always really, really hard for me. And one of the things that actually led to the discovery of ADHD was my freshman year in college, my first semester, I got a 2.2 GPA.
Got it. And by the way, I've been there.
So, not great, but, considering that I was probably opening up a few more beers than I was books, I earned what I got there. So second semester, my folks are saying, if you don't get these grades up, like you are coming home. We are not paying this tuition for you to get grades like that. Right. I was like, and my mom and I had a pretty sort of contentious relationship. And so I was like, all right, I got to figure this out. Like I'm not coming home. Like being away from home was amazing. Loved the freedom of it. I was just kind of coming into my element to be me. And so I spent a lot of time in the library, really missed a lot of the social pieces that during that year. And I was rewarded with a 1.8. So it was like, what the hell, right? Like, so at the time I was an advertising and marketing major in the communications department, and I was getting D's in all these classes. Right. And I was like, I'm trying. Like, I really am legitimately trying.
And you really felt like you were trying.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes. I had never really studied, well, anyways. It was the cramming. And so after that, I ended up doing worse. I got a letter from, so I had a bunch of grants that were basically saying, if you don't get your grades up, you lose these grants. So I was like, well, so I could still get these grants so these grants are telling me I have one more semester. So I was able to convince my parents for one more chance at school. During that summer between my freshman and sophomore year, and this is such an ADHD thing. So I don't even remember who the person was that I had a date with, but I had a date with this girl who had ADHD, and she was sharing with me what it was like for her having ADHD. And there was one part that I remember so vividly because it was one of these moments where you just feel like everything about you was just described in words that you didn't really know how to describe.
Mm-hmm.
And the key one was that she said was, it's like I start reading something and then I'm thinking about, something triggers a sort of tangential thought based on what I just read. And how that thought is triggering multiple other tangential thoughts. And I'm reading all the words on the page, but I'm not thinking about what I'm reading. I'm thinking about 10 other things. And I was like, that's not normal. Other people don't do that. So I'm like, that's what ADHD is. So I did a little bit of research. That very first week back on campus, I made an appointment with the school psychiatrist.
Okay, so I got to pause you right there, man, because that in itself is an incredible moment that is going to get lost on people. Most of us are going to figure out something's going on there. We're really not going to act on it. We don't want to know kind of what the truth is. So how were you able to flip the switch and say, I need to make this appointment for myself? Can you recall?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it was a lot of it was the avoidance of having to return home. To be honest, I talk about being misunderstood. My diagnosis growing up was lazy. My diagnosis growing up was, if you only cared, right? When the more that we understand about ADHD, not only is someone with ADHD not lazy, if we look at functional MRI scans of people doing things that maybe aren't as interesting to them, they are working so much harder than people without ADHD. But because we, judge behavior on what we can see, you can't see what's under the skull. And what's happening, in the brain is it requires way more effort than a neurotypical person to do kind of some of the same things. So lazy is one of those, I call it's the 4-letter word, like don't shame me with calling me lazy. I've been trying to redefine lazy, and that's the intentional choice to sit on the beach with a margarita and do nothing, right? Lazy is not, my taxes are late. I have these big deadlines to do. And so now I'm just going to sit and play guitar. That's executive dysfunction, which is a huge part of what ADHD is, right? So it's really understanding what it actually is versus what people think it is. And there is more information, and ADHD has been studied more than any other psychiatric disorder in history. And yet it is the most misunderstood disorder in mental health, right? There are still professional schools of psychology and related fields that are telling their, the future professionals in these fields that ADHD isn't real.
Really?
Really.
Okay, so you have your appointment with this woman or this man, the psychiatrist, and she or he kind of says, you know what, Eric, maybe you're rolling with ADD. So why don't we look at a couple of options? What were the first couple of attempts to course correct, if you will, or put you back on the tracks?
Well, I remember after the evaluation and then I going to the appointment for him to share with me the results of this. I remember him, he's like, so I'm looking at over everything we've done here. And he goes, you're saying you were never identified as having ADHD or growing up? It's like, because you kind of checked all the boxes here on the inattentive type of ADHD. And he's like, to be honest, I'm surprised you made it this far.
Wow. And you're thinking, so am I sometimes. So am I.
Yeah. It's because when I'm interested in something, when I'm intrinsically motivated by something, like ADHD doesn't get in the way, right? It's because, interest is neurological, right? And so when you're interested in something, the brain is firing on, more of the cylinders that it has available, right? So I get a prescription for Adderall. And so the very first time I took Adderall, so I was a sophomore, and I changed majors from advertising and marketing to social work with a minor in sociology. And I was reading this book. I actually still have it on my bookshelf there, called Crested Kimono. It was the comparative family systems in the Japanese business family.
Got it.
And this was the first time I read a chapter of a book. I got to the end of the chapter, and I knew what I had just read. And this is 20-some years ago, and I still get choked up telling this story. Because there was this part of me that goes, well, maybe I'm just dumb. But I also knew that there wasn't, because there was stuff that I knew I was able to figure out and make sense of and piece together in ways that were almost hard to explain. And I remember closing the book after reading that chapter and just having this profound feeling of both excitement and profound grief.
I can imagine, man. I can imagine the grief part for sure, because you're just thinking about, my God, everything that came before it.
Everything that came before. How this, I just remember thinking, this changes everything.
Everything. Yeah.
Changes. You know, the opening scene in The Simpsons where the clouds clear?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what it was like, where my brain was sort of in this like chaotic fog that I didn't even realize it was in, because that's all I ever knew. And all of a sudden the clouds kind of opened up. And the only thing I was thinking about was what I was reading. It was amazing. Like, my brain got so quiet that I didn't realize that this is something that people experience. I thought everyone was having 30 thoughts all at the same time, all the time.
Wow, man. I mean, my mind is being blown right now, and I'm sure others are too. And I just said generally have so many questions, because I'm one of these guys who's always got 30 thoughts going on in my head too. And so you're telling me that you take this Adderall, and this Adderall allows you to slow yourself down in a way. Are there things about taking the Adderall that are not as sexy for you? Like, do you experience any side effects that make it so you struggle with wanting to take the pill if you have to take the pill? And I know you may be not still on it now, or maybe you are, but let's talk about when you first got going.
Well, it's sort of interesting. So, there's a lot of professionals out there who are kind of like, well, it's just a personal choice whether you want to take meds. That's not the approach that I take. I'm like, can I swear on this podcast?
Of course, yeah.
Like, fucking try the medication, right? It is like, what people are like, oh, do it as a last resort. Well, first of all, the research says, no, do not wait to do that as a last resort. Why do you have to wait until you are struggling and failing at life so profoundly, right? When, like, the great thing about the meds for ADHD is, pretty quickly if it's going to work for you, right? So, shit, what was your question?
Well, yeah, it's that idea of when you take it, because let me try to draw my parallel here.
Yeah.
When I got started on my mental wellness journey, my mental health journey, I was with a psychiatrist, and I was trying a couple of different pills for anxiety and depression. And I could just never land on the one that made the sense for me, because while it would fix me in some areas, I didn't like the side effects in other areas. And so I'm wondering if while you started, or when you started to take the Adderall, did you notice things about you that you liked? And then did you miss some of the ADHD? Because I am somebody who can subscribe to this thought that our ADD or our ADHD can actually be our superpower too in some cases. So that is the question.
Okay. So I think probably the biggest side effect I personally had initially was dry mouth. And then, which, it's addressed with gum and water.
Right.
But then what was happening was I was starting to experience success.
Really?
And my first semester on Adderall, I got a 3.75, which I had never, ever gotten A's in my life. Like, never. And that is, I think, where perfectionism was born.
Yeah, buddy.
I was like, oh, I can do this. I just raised the bar really high, and I have to keep, getting over that bar. And so, I was on the 5-year plan at my undergrad, and every semester from that point on, I got a 3.5 and above, at the cost of missing out on a lot of the college experience, I believe, because I think that I was the hardest working student on that campus. Regularly pulling all-nighters. There was definitely times where I was taking more of the medication than I was prescribed to stay up and work.
But that makes sense to me. Like, this is new for you. You're in a state of mind that you've never been in. You're in a state of mind that maybe you've dreamed was possible. That, because those of us who probably deal with ADD and ADHD, we do, man. Like, there's a lot of times where, I want other people who don't necessarily have this to understand, where we are sitting there looking at a problem and our mind is about to blow up trying to think about how we're going to solve this thing, where so many people can go in and they're like, oh, we just got to start here. And then we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. But our brain has got a lot going on in it, and it almost makes it impossible to attack the problem.
Right. Because I find that one of the most common challenges I see is one with dealing with overwhelm. Right. Because our brain does not very intuitively grasp what is actually a priority. Right. I see that our brain prioritizes kind of the way, if you ever put your hand on one of those like plasma balls and the electricity goes to your hand. Like, it doesn't matter what finger it's on it. It goes to it sort of evenly divides. Right. So I say that the ADHD brain tends to prioritize based more on proximity than priority. Right. Whatever's right in front of you, whatever's shiniest, whatever's most interesting, loudest at the time, that's what gets your attention.
Right.
Not what's actually the actual most important thing.
So is Adderall one of those medications that you take and you can stop taking, or is it something that you kind of have to keep with for the rest of your life in some manner and in some level of dose?
Some people will say, I'm so afraid I'm going to get addicted to it. I say, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get it.
Right.
Right. Because it's like, to me, it's almost like glasses for your brain. Right. So I've been taking a stimulant medication since I was diagnosed. I still take a stimulant medication. I take a medication that's like an extended release version of that that gives me pretty much all day coverage. But going back to what you asked about the side effects, the anxiety definitely was spiking when after that first semester of success. And so I was taking then I got prescribed an anxiety medication. And then I was kind of like, it was kind of just made me not care about stuff. I was like,
dude, you're in my head, Eric. Get out of my head.
So I didn't like that. And then there were other things that I was doing that, like, my primary strategy that probably covered 80% of what I was needing to do was the Adderall, right? But like, one of the things I learned is you don't need drugs to hallucinate. You just need to not sleep for several days.
That's the truth.
I mean, and so I did this in such an unhealthy way, so I was, my sleep was awful. I wasn't really exercising much. And then, when I started grad school a couple of years after I finished my undergrad, it was a little bit more of I need more than just Adderall to figure this out. Cause I was realizing that I was sleeping like 2 hours a night. Like, wow. I didn't get the memo that you don't actually have to read everything when you're in grad school. I don't know. I must have missed that day. Cause that's what I was doing.
I mean, doesn't it make sense to you though? And I hope that it makes sense to everybody that's listening to us. Like, imagine you want this thing your whole life and then you finally get it. Like, of course you're going to just do it. That makes sense to me.
So I finished grad school with a 4.0.
There it is.
At the, initially that was a huge success. The more I've learned about just like self-care and that it's not just all about achieving, right? The more I look at that now, it's like, man, I wish I can go back and do that over, because I would have done it differently, right? Okay. I would have been happy with the 3.5 or the 3.0 and just
had a little bit more flow in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things that I really learned through this process too was not just the importance of self-awareness, but that how important it is to be able to advocate for what you what you need. One of the things that I think really helped me get through both undergrad and grad school was I negotiated the terms of almost every assignment and paper that I was given, because I struggled with writing. Like, writing was like a slow, painful process, because for me, by the time I was done writing half a sentence, my brain was already 4 sentences ahead. And now I remember what the second half of that sentence was going to be.
Right.
I mean,
and I'm only laughing because I feel the same thing.
That was knowing laughter. I definitely recognize that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. I want to. Okay, go ahead. And then I got a couple of questions I need to ask you.
Okay. So, this happens too. Usually on my podcast, when this happens, where I'm like, what the hell were we just talking about? I usually just leave it in, because people are like, oh, I so relate to that. So we leave it in. So I have no idea what I was just going to say.
All right, fair enough. So I'll move on. You mentioned a couple of little things along the way that I want to press you on just a little bit more. There's this idea of being misunderstood when you have ADD, ADHD, and it's gone undiagnosed, unrecognized. How were you mentioned a contentious relationship with your mom. How were you misunderstood in your own family, Eric?
I was kind of the black sheep, I guess, in my family. So I was the youngest. I had 2 older sisters. When my oldest sister is 8 years older than me. My middle sister is 4 years older than me. My freshman year of high school, my dad had a real serious brain injury. He had a brain aneurysm in the brainstem. And, it wasn't even till I was in college that I actually realized, so my dad is still alive, but realizing I actually lost my dad, the dad that I knew, the dad that I grew up with, because it changed him. It changed him in some pretty significant ways. And my dad was kind of my rock. And so watching him continue to try to do the things that he used to be able to do without being able to actually do these things anymore, because he was in financial services and did a lot of sales. And now he had slurred speech, and his vision was messed up, and he had balance issues. Right. So if you didn't know any better, you think this guy's had a few too many to drink, right?
Stroke or something like that.
And that's what it was. It's so watching him not accepting was really hard, because it really put me into this role of caretaker. And I was also very, I understand in hindsight, very inappropriately, I was my parents' therapist from a very young age. Like, they would have like issues, and I would be, trying to mediate between them. Right. And I think back to that now, I'm like, I'll give them the benefit of that if they didn't understand and know better. But how could they let their kid do that? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And so part of the relationship that I have with my mom now is there's a lot of boundaries in my relationship with her. Like, we're not that close. I've shown her the path on what she can do. It's up to her if she wants to do it. But until she does, like, we're going to have a pretty surface relationship. So it's, because it's, there was a couple of years ago, it was shortly after I started my business and with ADHD Rewired, where my mom says to me, "Oh, look at all you've done. Like, you used to be such a screw up kind of kid. Who would have thought you could be successful?" And my response to her was, "Fuck you. I did."
Yeah.
Right. And so it's, I've done a lot of therapy, as a trained therapist, I've done a lot of therapy, and a lot of that is, looking at the codependency piece and looking at like just self-image. And I remember working with my most recent therapist, who I was working with for a while. I got divorced last year. And when we first started working with each other, she said this thing to me. She goes, "So I'm hearing 2 different stories in what you're saying. Whose voice is this story? Because that doesn't sound like you." And I was like, kind of took me a second to reflect. And I was like, oh yeah, that's my mom's story. That, so there's a lot of reworking through my sort of self-concept and things like, feeling like I'm deserving.
Yeah, buddy. Well, Matt, you said something earlier that I almost jumped in and interrupted you with, and I'm glad I didn't. But that idea that if you grow up in a home where you feel less than valued, if you grow up in a home where you don't feel like the wind is in your sails, it becomes increasingly difficult for you to even want to advocate for yourself, because you won't advocate for yourself unless you value yourself, love yourself, want to take care of yourself. You just simply won't. And if you grow up in a way where people have kind of conditioned and trained you to not feel that way about yourself, it's going to be next to impossible for you to want to raise your hand and try to get some help. You just don't think you matter. You don't think that it will change anything if you do that. And I too have gone down the road of therapy many, many times. And speaking of parental relationships, one of the greatest tools that I was ever given was this idea of custodial relationships with people. And maybe this has been presented to you as well, but it's that idea. If you think about what a custodian does for a business, and that can be your relationship with people while you're in transition, while you're trying to figure your thing out. It's like, you don't have to be their best friend for a little while. You can just be custodial. You can check in with them. If things get broken, you can dip in and try to offer some assistance. But by and large, you're really just there to kind of tidy things up. You're not really in that relationship to win it necessarily. And that gave me a little bit of freedom while I was going through my own transitions, was to say, okay, yeah, you're right. You're like, I don't need to fix her or him. I can just work on me. I can just work on my boundaries and figure out what my life is all about, because you and I have so many parallels, man, which is crazy. When I'm 23 years old, my father drops dead of a heart attack in front of me. And so like your parallel of your dad having this major life event at about that same age, like I really resonate with that. The game changed at an early age for you, and there is like before and after. And it is such a wiring. Can I ask you how ADD impacts relationship before and after drugs? You know what I mean? Like relationships before you found a medication that worked for you, and relationships after?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that one of the things that, we hear about this, that sometimes when people are taking medication, they get so sort of like focused on like accomplishing things that they forget that there's other things in life than just accomplishing things. And I think that there may be some of that that may be true for me. I've never been great at maintaining long-term friendships, which is really common with ADHD. I think that acceptance in a relationship is so, so important. Where if someone makes me feel crappy for something that's a function of my ADHD, I'm like, this relationship is not going to work. Mm-hmm. Right.
Which is a boundary, by the way, for people that are paying attention.
Right. So, I think part of the self-worth issue, led to me marrying the person I did, who like at the time I thought was the right person. Turns out not. So I was married for about 11 years. Kind of jumped into it after 6 months. Like we got engaged. 6 months later, we got married. My therapist says, "What the fuck was the hurry?" And part of that is I married someone that my parents would certainly approve of. Interesting. Yeah. So the other thing, like one of the other big changes in my life over the last couple of years is I've been coming out as a bisexual man, and which there's not a lot of bisexual men who are open and out there. And part of this desire to come out really stems from like, oh my God, if I wasn't like, because I had come out to my parents when I was about 14 as being bi. So my dad responded by the following day, bringing home a Playboy magazine for me, which told me two things. one, he didn't approve. Two, he didn't understand what I meant by bi, because I was like, thanks, Dad, for the magazine. I'll enjoy it.
I'll enjoy that.
Yeah. Yep. And my mom was like, oh, it might just be a phase. And so, it was like, the message is real clear. Like, yeah, we're not okay with that. So I stayed in the closet for, so much of my life. And, and I wrestled with this because sort of authenticity and vulnerability is really core to what I do, both personally and professionally. And then I had this area of my life where I'm like feeling very much like an imposter, right? Where I'm like, I'm masquerading as an ally, right? And
man, I feel that sometimes.
As going through my divorce, I announced it on the podcast, and it's funny. I wanted to tell all the people in my life, so I didn't want them to hear it first in the podcast. So my last kind of holdout was my grandma, who I talked to, and she's like, "I don't care who you love," which I'm totally not surprised by. When I brought this up to my parents, my mom's like, I have no recollection of the story that you're telling us. She's like, "I believe you, but I don't remember this," and I still can't wrap my head around that. Like, how do you not remember that?
Right. Because it was such a big moment for you.
So kind of taking things like that, taking things like seeing my dad sort of struggle to accept and adapt, right? With learning in college that I had ADHD. And during that time too, I was introduced to one of my social work courses I don't know if you're familiar with the Johari's window. It's a concept around self-awareness. So you have it's like a 4-square quadrant. In one, you have your public self, so the things that you know about yourself and other people know about you. You have your private self, the things that only you know about yourself, but other people don't. You have your blind spots, which are the things that other people either know about you or see in you, but you don't see it yourself. And that's usually where therapy and coaching take place, is try to uncover those blind spots. And then you have the unknowables, right? So things that you just haven't had maybe the opportunity to discover. And so I learned this concept right around the time I got diagnosed with ADHD. So it was like this big blind spot got opened up, right? And so I'm learning about this. And when I was in grad school, I sort of was taking that idea to the next level, wanting to help students who had invisible disabilities like ADHD, learning disabilities, dyslexia, really understand themselves better, right? So I did that. My research was all around helping middle school students develop self-awareness, self-advocacy skills, and self-determination. And the reason it chose those 3 things is what the research shows on sort of long-term outcomes for overall life satisfaction, earning potential, home ownership, relationship status. When you can have an invisible disability like ADHD, but you have a strong level of self-awareness, you have a good self-advocacy skills, you have that self-determination to understand what you got to do to do what you want to do, right? Side by side, there is no difference in those outcomes when you compare it to neurotypical peers. And so we look at, it's not the disability, it's not the different brain wiring, it's not the whenever the challenge is, that's not what holds people back from living the life that they want to live. It's understanding it and accepting it. It's developing the skills. I mentioned when I was, one of the things that helped me get through school was advocating for sort of slight tweaks to the papers and things like that to write to make it more interesting to me. Because if I was interested, I could focus on it. If not, it was almost impossible for me. So it was that, and then plus with the self-determination, right? It's knowing that you have autonomy, you have agency in what you're doing. And I think it's such an important thing for anyone who just feels like they do things differently from other people, right? That if we are willing to, and it's one of the concepts I talk about in my coaching program, in order to be successful with ADHD, you got to be willing to bend the world to you. Because you probably have noticed the world isn't reaching out to bend itself towards you.
Right. As we wind down a little bit, I want to ask you about any non-traditional therapies that you've discovered along the way that might benefit folks who, roll with ADD or ADHD. Medication is certainly one road, but have you been tipped off to others? Have you been tipped off to any other things in life that you found to be beneficial?
Absolutely. So yeah, because here's the thing: pills don't teach skills, right? But they can help you learn them. And they can help you actually use them. Because one of the core things from ADHD, it's a performance disorder. It's like, we know what to do, right? The issue is doing it, right? We often call it the disorder of good intentions, right? It's like, and we're consistently inconsistent, right? Which is, trust me, is more frustrating for the person with ADHD as it is for the person around the people with ADHD, right? So, in what I have developed professionally was all based on what I wanted personally. Right? I was in therapy and I was doing the thing that, I didn't want my own clients to be doing. So I would get therapy homework from my therapist, and I would actually show up to my next week's therapy appointment about 20 minutes early, so I could sit in the parking lot and do the homework that I was supposed to be working on all week. And I'm like, this is outrageous. Like, I give my own clients homework, and like, I want them to do it during the session. And I was like, I need faster check-ins, right? I need to have a week between, sessions was too long for me, right? I needed someone to check in with. So like, I started looking out there to see what's available for something like that. And there was nothing. So I created something like that. So I created my coaching and accountability groups, which are these intensive 10-week, 3 days a week. You get paired with accountability partners, right? And one of the things that I have discovered, and I am like dying to find a PhD researcher who can actually come in and look at my program, remove me from it so it's not biased, so it's good research design. Because I think that group work in this realm is so fucking powerful. Yeah, I used to do intense one-on-one work. Comparing that to group work, it's night and day. It is night and day. Because here's what happens. As people with ADHD, we tend to hold so much self-judgment and shame. And when we hear other people sort of saying out loud some of the maybe self-critical things that we think, but then see, wow, but they're kind of kicking ass in these areas. Why are they being so hard on themselves? And then you start to realize, oh wait, I guess that's me too, right? And so in a group setting, for the first time, you may have these, a dozen sort of mirrors looking back at you, except this time there's no judgment. And when you can let go of the judgment and put down the shame and be vulnerable without the shame, that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, buddy.
So, for me, group work is where it's at, right? It's, very CBT based. It's very experiential. We talk about like, I'm not giving you the formula. I could give you the formula, but there's a problem with the formula. You're one of the ingredients, right? So you have to experiment. Here's the framework. I'm providing the sandbox, right? Here's the framework. You got to make it your own though. Right?
I like that.
I tell people that, like, look, if you want the formula, like there'll be plenty of people who are eager to sell you the formula. The issue is they're not actually trying to help you. Right? They're trying to sell you something, because having a formula, that sounds much easier than telling me that, oh, there isn't an exact formula and I have to iterate and experiment, and you're just going to give me some, a shovel and some pails, and I have to play in the sandbox to figure it out. It's like, well, yeah.
I'm tempted to play this clip right now from an earlier podcast that we had where Dr. Frank Bavacqua, who's a psychologist, says this. Listen to this.
That's why advice is terrible. Because most of the time when we get advice from somebody, really what most of the time they're telling us to do is what they would do if they were you.
Okay, so he goes on to basically say that advice is horrible because most people are just trying to tell you what they think they would do. They can't actually get into your shoes and your body and your mind to give you some solid advice.
We always tell people, don't give shouldy advice.
Yeah, right? Shouldy advice.
Don't should on me. I won't should on you. And I tell people right at the start of our groups, I'm like, awesome. So I'm going to do this really annoying thing. You're going to ask me a question. And it's probably going to be what should I do about this question? And my response, if I'm doing what I'm hoping you're paying me to do, I am going to respond with a question. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want all of you to begin to learn to do, is stop just looking for the answers. Start looking for the questions.
Yes, bud. Yes.
That's where we make the discoveries, is through brainstorming questions and experimentation and curiosity and non-judgment. And I wonder what would happen if I tried that, and not being so attached to the outcome, just being curious. Did that work? Right. Great. If it didn't, great. You discovered it didn't work.
You still learned something, is what you're saying. Yes. As we wind down, you mentioned there was a moment in your life where you're listening to, I don't know if it was a podcast or you're watching a video, but Brene Brown, who a lot of people are familiar with, she said something that changed your world. What was that?
It was, and this was after I was in the midst of my second registration events for my coaching groups. So I'm still kind of new in online business. I am really almost obsessively focused on not missing a week on the podcast. I'm almost at my 50th episode, and I'm exhausted making all this content, doing this launch, and I'm taking a lunch break, listening to The Power of Vulnerability. It's a talk she gave. It's on Audible. And she's going through what she calls her 10 guideposts for wholehearted living. And I'm walking, and I'm even thinking about some of my marketing content, which is about supercharging your productivity. Mm. And I hear her say, we have to let go of productivity as a measure of our self-worth.
I don't like that you just said that. I don't like that.
I refer to that
so well with me, Eric.
That was the moment that I got punched in the gut by Brene Brown. And I was like, shit, I'm doing this wrong. And I really started changing both how I show up personally and what I do professionally, because it is not all about what we get done each day, right? It's about always showing up as our most authentic self.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Well, I hope you walked away from that podcast the same way I did, completely enlightened, informed, maybe feeling a little bit more connected, maybe even grounded in, a truth that you're not alone and there's other people who kind of think and act this way too. It's certainly how I felt. You can visit Eric Tivers online at ADHDrewired.com, ADHDrewired.com. Coming up in the next couple of weeks, some crazy good podcast. We're going to sit down with one of the guys in charge of Dope Black Dads, Umar Kankaya, all the way from the UK. And then we're going to sit down with a woman who grew up in Armenia, who had her life changed in 12 seconds when she lost her entire family because of an earthquake. The story is unbelievably heartbreaking, yet incredibly inspirational. And both of those stories are coming up in the next couple of weeks here on Learn from People Who Lived It. Have a great day.